So hi everybody, I'm Sarah. For a few more weeks I'm a postback at Yale, and then I'll be starting graduate school this fall at Princeton. And I want to start by asking you to consider this really simple scenario that probably is pretty familiar to a lot of you, which is in this case, let's imagine that there's this CEO sitting at their desk and they've been handed the final version of this report before some deal is going to go through, and it's really the very last stages. So this report is going to tell you everything that's going to happen if this project moves forward, including, in this case, some environmental damages, let's say. And it's set up such that all this person has to do is hit the relevant button that will either immediately approve the project and it'll get started, or it'll be rejected and not happen. And so all they have to do is reach out and hit that button. So they sit there, they really think about everything that's going to happen, and they decide that they're going to approve the project moving forward, and so very deliberately reach out and press that relevant button. So it happens, the project immediately breaks ground, and all this stuff happens exactly as was outlined in that initial report. And in this case, it probably feels at least pretty okay to then conclude by saying something like it's the CEO that caused the environmental damage. There's probably not a lot of controversy about whether that feels like an appropriate way to describe at least part of what's happened here. But the contrast that I'm interested in is if you keep that case in the back of your mind and imagine this very similar scenario that starts exactly the same way, same person sitting at their desk, the final version of this report before the project gets started, and again set up such that all they have to do is press the relevant button. But in this case, maybe it's just really hot that day, or they ran out of coffee or whatever, but they pass out and fall out of their chair instead of being able to think through what's going on, and their hand hits the button. Still approves the project, everything happens exactly as it happened in the first case, including everything that was detailed in that report. But now, if I asked you to say something like, it's the CEO that caused the environmental damage, that probably feels a lot stranger to say in a case like this, when they're acting with such limited agency that they've really just fallen out of their chair. And there's been a lot of really interesting research in cognitive science about this kind of effect that's contrasting these two cases, where in a lot of ways they're really similar. The same thing has happened in a lot of ways, right? There's the same person, the same action, the button's pressed, and the same thing happens. But because of the way in which that person is acting, it makes a lot of sense in one case and at least feels a little bit weird in the other. And this seems to be a way in which the amount of agency a person is acting with changes the extent to which we think they caused a particular outcome. And cog-sci in general, and also especially causal cognition, is really interested in trying to understand what's going on in cases like this. Here's just a random subset of some of the papers that are discussing effects like these ones of perceptions of agency on causal judgments. But as maybe foreshadowed by the title of my talk today, I'm going to be taking a pretty strange approach maybe for this session titled Causation. And I'm going to argue that best understanding these particular effects actually isn't going to involve focusing so much on causal cognition in particular. In fact, I'm going to argue that the way that perceived agency is involved in our judgments of scenarios like this one is actually going to be a much broader effect that's going to apply to a range of judgments that aren't just about causal evaluations. And I'm going to show you 4 experiments that are in sort of showing that, 2 of which are covered in detail in our cog-sci proceedings, and 2 of which we've since conducted since then. All this starts with this really basic, simple question, which is just when is it that we see these effects of agency and when do we not? And maybe more specifically, to what extent is answering that question wrapped up in something about understanding how it is that we make causal judgments, and to what extent is answering it really about something else? We get at this question really most directly in our first experiment, where we ask whether we're going to be seeing these effects just in sentences about causation, like the ones that I showed you in that really dumb opening example, or whether we might also see similar things when people are asked to make judgments about sentences that aren't causal. And to make that concrete, I'm going to walk you through one of the 4 vignettes that we use throughout our experiments. In this particular case, participants will be introduced to a character named Tom, who we say is waiting for a train on a station where you're not supposed to cross this yellow line on the platform. And in one set of conditions, Tom crosses that line deliberately. He walks across it in a way that we might normally say is intentional. He's just standing on the other side. In the other set of conditions, it's really hot, he blacks out, and he falls over that line. So he acts with basically as minimal agency as possible in that scenario. And regardless of the way in which Tom has acted, we see the same thing happens as a result that ultimately ends up creating this train delay. And what we then do is we take those cases where Tom acts with full or with really limited agency, and we get our participants to evaluate one of 2 different sentences. Either they're asked to evaluate that causal claim that we've been talking about, so Tom caused a train delay in this case, or a sentence that's not causal that still describes Tom's actions, like Tom crossed the line. And so we end up is with this 2x2 design where you have across the x-axis those cases where they're making the causal judgment and those evaluating those non-causal sentences, and the cases where Tom acted with full or with low agency in the particular scenario. And across the 4 vignettes that we use, the sentences that are non-causal involve the verbs touch, hit, cross, and enter. There's a lot more I could say about like these particular verbs or why we chose them, but for now I'll just say something really brief, which is that what we mean by them being non-causal is like there's obviously some set of verbs that's not the word cause that we still talk about as causal verbs, so things like burn or break, where Tom broke the vase is exactly the same thing as Tom caused the vase to break. But these verbs are critically not part of that class of verbs, even though they're like actions Tom could take. So Tom crossed the line is not the same thing as Tom caused the line to cross. You can't rephrase it in that same way. And I'm going to show you these results collapsed across our 4 different vignettes, even though we use these different sentences, because participants tend to be really consistent across these cases. And the first thing there is just the known effect, wherein how much agency Tom acted with changes the extent to which you think he caused that particular outcome, right? That sentence makes like perfect sense if Tom acted with full agency in like a really normal way, and it at least seems like a weird thing to say in the other case. Participants' responses are much more varied once it's the case that poor Tom like passed out and fell over the line. But what we're really interested in here is what happens in those non-causal cases. And one thing you might expect, if these effects of agency really are something specific to how we're making causal judgments and determining what counts as like part of a cause of an event, is something like this. Because you might think that in this cases, agency should be pretty irrelevant to evaluating sentences like Tom crossed the line, because you're no longer in that realm of making causal judgments. So it shouldn't be involved in the same way as it is involved in those causal cases, if it's the case that the thing we really care about here is something specific to causal judgments. But instead, we actually find that participants are really remarkably consistent across these cases. And so we think that the role of agency really seems to be the same. So long as participants are making judgments about the same sorts of sentences that have the same animate agent, Tom in this case, in that subject, are really as like the theme there. And so whether or not people are evaluating a causal claim in particular doesn't actually seem to be the most relevant factor in determining whether or not we're going to care about the agency of the character who's acting in that same way. And so from this experiment, it seems like the effect of agency can't best be understood as something about causation, because that's not the thing that's most determining whether or not this kind of agency matters to the way that people are evaluating these claims. It seems that acting with agency must play some broader role that's going to be able to apply across both these causal and non-causal judgments. And it's really just like this finding that's the crux of our view in this project. But in our next few experiments, we're trying to get a better handle of really what we mean by the effect of agency being specific to agents like Tom, but broad enough to apply across these multiple contexts. The first way that we try to get a better hold of what's going on here in our second experiment is to ask about cases where something like doesn't have any agency at all. And here's what I mean by that. So far we've been talking about these scenarios where you have Tom, who is an agent who has the capacity to act with agency and does act with agency in a particular instance, so he walks deliberately over that line. And we've had a case where you still have Tom, who's still like an agent with the capacity to act with agency, but he isn't in this particular case, right, because he just passes out and sort of falls over the line. But you can sort of also imagine that very similar things could happen without the subject of those sentences being something that is capable of agency in sort of a normal way. You might think that instead there's like a rainstorm, water floods the train station, and the water that's across that line can cause everything in exactly the same way as Tom did. And you might sort of feel on yourself that that doesn't feel the same as when Tom is acting with limited agency, even though I wouldn't say like the water across that line is acting in any sort of intentional or agential way. So you can see now that we've added that condition of having the inanimate object across the 3 agency conditions, and starting with what happens when participants are asked to make that causal judgment. And you can sort of maybe feel yourself, the water causing something is totally fine to say, even though it's not acting with agency in the way that Tom did when he walked deliberately across the line. So these particular effects seem to not just be about agency per se. It's something about both having the capacity for agency and not exercising it in a particular moment that makes participants think that it's no longer a correct way to describe the scenario to say that whatever caused a particular outcome. And again, a critical finding that we're finding in this experiment is that we replicate that same pattern or result across our causal and non-causal judgments. So again, the effective agency is consistent across causal versus non-causative sentences, and where it's specific is to something about how we talk and reason about agents like Tom. It matters to how we're thinking about animate agents, but the lack of agency of stuff that we normally don't think of as having the capacity for agency doesn't matter so much. One obvious next question we had is that it might be that the reason that you get this difference between stuff like Tom and stuff like the water is that maybe you want to hold Tom responsible for doing annoying things to you, like causing train delays. But you can't really be upset with the water and have it think it's like morally blameworthy in the same way. So to see if sort of this might explain what's going on with the effects that we're seeing, what we do is take the exact same scenarios that you've seen, and we modify them in a few key ways so that we can keep the same causal structure, but make everything that happens totally innocuous. So no more yellow lines, like no more train stations. Tom is at a carnival where you can play this game where you cross certain lines, and like whipped cream will come down on desserts and you can keep them. So we can ask about the really like innocuous sentence now of Tom causing the stream of whipped cream. And because we set these scenarios up to be otherwise analogous to the scenarios where stuff that was morally blameworthy happened, we can also ask about that same non-causal sentence about Tom crossing the line in the same way. So now you can see that across the x-axis, I've added that additional division between the scenarios where something negative happens and the scenarios where everything is completely neutral. And overall, here's what we find. What we really care about here is very simple, which is that in all of these cases, we're observing the same basic effect, where both the causal and non-causal and the negative and neutral sentences make more sense when Tom acts with full agency, right, the red bars, than they do when he's acting with minimal agency. And that's true even when Tom is doing something completely harmless. You might notice that the effect looks a little bit stronger in some cases than others, specifically where something negative is happening and Tom has caused a particular outcome. That is true. I can talk more about sort of why we think there might be some differences here. But our key takeaway is that the basic effect does exist across all of the scenarios. And so the effective agency can't itself just be about blame. And trying to understand what it is about the agency of animate agents that we care about when we observe these particular effects, it seems like it can't just be about trying to blame those agents for those actions. There has to be something about agency itself, since there's some additional effect even in the cases where nothing morally blameworthy is happening. All that being said, there's a sort of funny way in which across all these experiments, we've been talking about these effects of agency without actually getting a clear handle on what it means to act with full agency or minimal agency. And a lot of things can be going on here, right? Sort of in like an ordinary sense, if I talk about what it means to do something intentionally, I could intentionally like dump my water over my friend. I could also like intentionally be pouring it out and like accidentally get it on them. I could also, like poor Tom, like pass out right now and knock it over. And all of those like feel like really different things are going on in terms of how much agency I'm exercising. And so what we're trying to do in this last experiment is to start to get a handle of which of these particular aspects we're talking about when we're talking about these effects that seem to be applying in these causal and non-causal cases. The way that we do that is design similar scenarios to what we've been doing so far, where we can really separate out between some of those different aspects of agency. So here, Tom's at this local park, and local races often finish here. So there's this like area where there's not a line drawn on the ground, but it's often used as like a finishing line for races. And it's set up such that when someone crosses that line, confetti's going to fall and celebrate that they've like finished the race. And what we can then do is separate between aspects of agency that we think really might matter here. One thing that we do is talk about whether Tom is aware of what he's doing. So both knowing that there's a finish line set up there and what's going to happen when it's crossed, the confetti is going to fall. And it seems like this kind of knowledge is really a part of what we mean normally when we say someone is acting intentionally or not. The other thing we care about, because we've been using it so far in our scenarios, it's the idea that you can sort of exercise agency in some like physical way in the way you're actually acting. So the difference between Tom like running deliberately through the park and the case where he trips and stumbles and sort of goes flying across that line. So now we have these two types of things that might matter to part of agency, and you can see the physical agency conditions in the colors, and then across the x-axis you have the things where Tom knows or doesn't know. And again, for the sake of time, I'll show all of these results at once. And there's some subtle variations here that I can talk more about if people are interested. But what we find overall is just that there's a pretty consistent effect, not of whether Tom knew what he was doing, but whether he's actually like exercising agency in the way he's like physically acting in that moment. And so in addition to some recent work demonstrating the ways that epistemic awareness might influence causal judgments, at least in this particular effect that we've been interested in here, there seems to be instead some effect of exercising agency in some like physical way in the actual moments that you're moving. And we've been really intrigued by this, not just for this set of experiments, but sort of as an aside. It also starts to speak to a broader area of cognitive science about how to define what it means for something to be an agent or to act with agency. It seems sometimes we care about things beyond whether or not agents are epistemically aware of what's going on. And with all of that, it seems like our key takeaway is still sort of that thing I talked about in our first experiment, which is that the effect of agency can't be specific to causation, at least not these effects that we're talking about here. And this is maybe sort of funny again in this particular talk section. But I actually think one of the reasons that you might really care about this kind of result is specific to causal cognition, which is that there's been a lot of really interesting work that's trying to contend with how best to build theories of how we make causal judgments around sort of maybe odd or surprising things that influence the way people make those judgments. And one possible thought here is that these particular effects don't matter in that particular way. And they maybe can't or even shouldn't be accounted for by theories of causal cognition. Instead, we have to be thinking about some sort of more general way that we can understand the effect that agency is having in cases like this one. And just very, very briefly, I'll preview one type of way we think that one might approach a question like that now without focusing on causation, just using the sentence you've seen a lot now of Tom causing the train delay. So very roughly, when you see this sentence, you might think that you mean something like there's some event that was the causing of the train delay, and Tom is the agent that caused that event. And if you think that picture is roughly true, there's sort of two places where agency could matter as you're making a judgment of whether that sentence feels correct. And the first is like something to do with what it means to be an event that's a cause, but the other is something to do with what it means for Tom to be the agent that brought about that event. And very, very roughly what we're saying is that the answer that we should look for understanding these effects is going to be in that second part, in what it means for Tom to be an agent of a particular event, because that's going to help us understand why we're seeing these consistent effects across these kinds of cases, where there are very different events being described. Some are causal and some are not, but the fact that Tom is the agent of those actions is the same. This is really only like the roughest possible preview of the whole other side of this project that is about the linguistics of these sentences. We preview it a little bit in our CogSci proceedings, but also I'm lucky that one of my collaborators is a linguist and has been working on this really interesting sort of other aspect to this that I don't have time to get into today. But in addition to talking to me, if you're interested in the particulars of how we would understand these sentences, I also really encourage you to talk to Fabienne. She's amazing, and I've had so much fun getting to work on all the different aspects of this project. So that being said, thanks so much to all of my really wonderful collaborators, and I think we might be over time, but maybe I can take one question. Cool.